Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to the 10th Asia Privacy Bridge Forum 2021. I am pleased for this opportunity to share Singapore's views on cross-border data flows and data protection, which are of growing importance in the digital economy. Data is a non-rigorous resource. Different organizations can work on their respective copies of the same dataset, each having an opportunity to benefit from it. The ability to benefit comes down to having imagination and the drive to acquire the skills to work with data. Therefore, data should not be treated as a resource or commodity to be hoarded within national borders. With accelerated digitalization, we have seen an exponential increase in data generation and data flows. Data flows are foundational to the digital economy, and there has never been a more compelling time for economies to build common standards and principles together to allow data to flow smoothly and safely across borders. As early as the turn of this century, there was keen recognition that data, including personal data, needed to be transferred across borders in a trustworthy manner. In the context of data protection laws, this was articulated as the principle of accountability. Accountability is a core principle of data protection regimes based on the 1980 OECD guidelines on the protection of privacy and trans-border flows of personal data. In the context of cross-border transfers, it manifests as a requirement that a data controller transfers data to an overseas recipient only after being assured that the recipient is able to accord a comparable standard of protection to the data that it receives. An early example is Canada's Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, which requires organizations to use contractual or other means to provide a comparable level of protection while the data is processed by a third party. The accountability principle is also the cornerstone of the APB privacy framework and its certification systems for accountable cross-border transfers of personal data, the APB cross-border privacy rules, and the privacy recognition for processors systems. I will speak more about these systems later on. More recently, during the Japanese chairmanship of the 2019 G20 Leaders Summit, then Prime Minister Abe mooted his concept of data-free flow with trust. This was endorsed by the G20 Osaka Leaders Declaration, committing to further facilitate data-free flow and strengthen consumer and business trust. A group of 23 countries, including the Republic of Korea and Singapore, along with the European Union, joined to launch the Osaka Track, affirming the importance of harnessing the full potential of data and data economy, and committing to promote international rulemaking on trade-related aspects of e-commerce at the WTO. Over the years, global norms have begun to emerge. The first principle is that countries should refrain from restricting cross-border data flows. An early articulation may be found in the 1980 OECD Privacy Guidelines, which exhorted member countries to avoid developing laws, policies, and practices which would create obstacles to trans-border flow of personal data that would exceed the requirements for ensuring equivalence protection. A more recent articulation may be found in the e-commerce chapter of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the CPTPP, which commits signatories to two complementary obligations. First, to allow for the cross-border transfer of information, including personal information, by electronic means for the conduct of business. Second, not to require businesses to use or locate computing facilities within the country as a condition for conducting business. Restrictions to these commitments are permitted only if they are non-discriminatory and necessary to achieve legitimate public policy objectives. Although we have been a party to various free trade agreements with e-commerce chapters, with the shift towards a digital economy, we need an updated set of global norms for the free and trusted flow of data across borders. It is with this objective in mind that Singapore pioneered the Digital Economy Agreements, which align common digital standards and systems for digital trade, thereby facilitating cross-border data flows. It is necessary for building the digital economy to entrench as a global norm the principle that cross-border flows of data by electronic means, whether it is personal, business, or machine data, should be allowed. Any restriction imposed should be limited to those necessary to achieve legitimate public policy objectives. An example of an established public policy objective is the assurance of equivalent protection for personal data transferred across borders. Requiring the use of local computing facilities or the local storage of data as a condition for conducting business restricts trade and should therefore not be recognized as a legitimate public policy objective. These clarifications are important for the digital economy. They enable businesses to access cloud-based services which can lower costs and grow new markets through e-commerce. So far, we have signed DEAs with Chile, New Zealand, and Australia in 2020. We are negotiating a DEA with Korea and recently launched negotiations with the UK. Through DEAs, we hope to deepen cooperation and alignment in digital and data issues with like-minded partners. How then should data transfers be facilitated while ensuring comparable protection? When the Asian Business Law Institute conducted a comparative review of transfer mechanisms recognized by Asian jurisdictions, it identified contracts, binding corporate rules, and certification as having the greatest potential for convergence, while consent remained adequate for residual circumstances. Consents and contracts are part of the global norm for data transfers, and upon which interoperability of global data protection and privacy regimes can be built. While consent is adequate for residual circumstances, it is not ideal for systematic or recurrent transfers, especially when it is common for businesses to change service providers periodically. Contractual clauses are widely used by businesses around the world. They allow a business to impose data protection and security requirements on the receiving party. A widely known example is the EU standard contractual clauses, which were first promulgated in 2001 and updated earlier this year. In ASEAN, we have the ASEAN Model Contractual Clauses, a more flexible template recognized by all 10 ASEAN member states and ready for use since January 2021. Aside from recognizing binding corporate rules, we need to also recognize contract-based mechanisms for intra-group transfers, which are essential for supporting the centralization of corporate functions within multinational corporations. Even though binding corporate rules and intra-group agreements differ in their legal nature, both serve to accomplish the same corporate objectives. The acceptance of consents and contracts, including binding corporate rules, as extant global norms for permissible safeguards may be uncontroversial but cannot be taken for granted. We hope that our efforts in DEAs and other upcoming trade agreements will contribute towards their acceptance as global norms. In the longer term, the use of certification as a mechanism for data transfers holds great promise as a new global norm. A number of countries, such as the Republic of Korea, Japan, and Singapore, have domestic data protection certification systems, and the EU GDPR recognizes certification as a new transfer mechanism. A tried and tested certification system for cross-border transfers is the APEC CBPR and PRP systems, which I mentioned earlier. CBPR and PRP are comprehensive certification mechanisms for cross-border data transfers. They have the advantage of allowing for intra- and inter-company transfers between certified companies in participating APEC member economies. There are currently 9 participating economies, including Singapore, Japan, Chinese Taipei, the Republic of Korea, Philippines, and the USA. Their population is about 645 million, and their combined value of trade is about 3.3 trillion US dollars. ASEAN has intimated an intention to develop a certification system as part of the ASEAN cross-border data flows mechanism to complement the ASEAN model contractual clauses. This builds momentum for certification to become a global norm for cross-border transfers. The Center of Information Policy Leadership, a global privacy and data policy think tank, even suggested the possibility of a global certification mechanism requiring only one approval process. This could happen if non-APEC countries adopt mechanisms similar to and interoperate with the CDPR. There is still much work to be done in articulating and establishing new global norms concerning data flows. What I have discussed are fairly uncontroversial, yet there are new areas that require further discussions at the appropriate forums. For example, the ability for law enforcement to request for and access data across borders. Convergence for data flows and data protection through international rules, frameworks, agreements, and other mechanisms are key steps that countries must take to harness the full potential of the digital economy. The digital economy is a fast-moving area, and we look forward to more countries and partners participating in these regional and international processes. Thank you all for your attention. I look forward to having a deeper discussion with you on these topics in our panel discussion coming up soon.